Hello everyone, good evening and welcome to today's session. So today we are going to cover and start chapter number 2. Now what is chapter number 2? Chapter number 2 talks about general auditing principles and what are the responsibilities of the auditor with respect to audit of a financial statement. In this chapter, what we are going to do is we are going to understand some critical standards like SA 240, 250, 260, 65, 99 and 402. Okay. So if you see the chapter number 2, it talks about the general auditing principles like as during the audit, what are the general principles and general things the auditor is required to look into or consider about. Okay, when I say general means that is a presumed responsibilities of the auditor or kind of auditor has to look into on those areas. And secondly, when I say auditor's responsibility, now responsibility with respect to fraud, responsibility with respect to laws and regulations, responsibility with respect to communication, responsibility with respect to other areas, we will understand all those things in this particular chapter. So as I will progress, I will request everyone to ask as many doubts as you can. Okay, if you have even smallest doubt, please ask. That is very important. We will be taking up a lot of questions during the session in between to enhance your understanding about the topic. Okay, and I want answers from your side. Okay, so let's start the session now. As I said, that it is about the general principles of auditing and auditor's responsibility, and with that we start our first standard that we need to understand in order to understand the auditor's responsibility and the you can say the audit principles is SA 240. Now SA 240 is a very important and critical standard. Okay, very important and critical reason because it kind of provides the duties or the responsibilities or what auditor is required to do for the purpose of when there is an you can say fraud or any kind of schemes that have been devised in the financial statement. Okay, window dressing, any kind of fraud, or if auditor identifies that kind of fraud, then what auditor is required to do, or even what auditor is required to do when he has not identified the fraud, like any additional procedures auditor is required to perform. So we need to understand all those things in that particular standard. SA 240, that is the auditor's responsibility relating to fraud in an audit of financial statement. Okay. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have done the audit till now or being part of the audit teams, but whosoever been part of audit team, tell me what you do to identify fraud, or in an audit, how do you consider the fraud element? So when you are auditing a particular entity or financial statements of a particular entity, what do you consider from the fraud's point of view? Like, okay, today, let's say for example, your friend has approached you, please audit my company. You started the audit, you accepted the engagement, perfectly fine. Now what you will consider, like from the fraud's point of view, what additional you will do? Yes, Anila. Okay, great. So here we are talking about auditor's responsibility. So what do you think is the auditor's responsibility when it comes to the fraud? What additional you will do with respect to the fraud in an audit? Anila, can you explain your last answer? Like, how it is linked to the how it is linked or related to the fraud.
Sir,
Let's say
actually,
I want. Yes, yes.
whoever have the access to enter into the system, so that there may be the chances of error. Means password protected. If only the accountant is allowed, or any other person can easily access that system.
Absolutely correct. Good. Very good. Very good. Okay, Ginny. Very good. What else? Anything else you would do? Anything you would additionally do, or anyone else? What you would do when it comes to the fraud? Come on, guys. Yes, Prashant. Very good. Yes, Anila. Okay, great. But what additional checks you would implement, and when you would implement?
So if we have any doubt on some fraud, that area we will have an additional. If we are taking some sample of population, we may extend that population or related party to that transaction. We will just dig into and check it, sir.
Okay. But let's say, for example, there are lot many areas when we do a audit. It's revenue, expense, fixed asset, debtors, creditors, loans, various type of expenses, other adjustment. Which area you would look for, or where, or in which areas you will perform additional checks?
Mainly revenue,
Hmm. And why revenue? Any specific?
because
because
that is the area it can be manipulated easily.
Okay.
to meet the targets at the year end, the staff might be overstating the revenues and all those things can be increased. And
Okay.
expenses also will be looking so as to not to pay the.
Yes, Yogesh. Yes, correct.
We may also look into the assets based on the assets of the firms. They might be taking loan, personal loan kind of things. So we have to look into those papers also, what they are taking and what not.
Correct. Yes, absolutely correct. See, one additional question I have, when we say we need to look into that area, how to look into? Like, for looking into that particular area, what we should do?
Vouch the invoices.
Audit procedures have been performed on those areas, checking the invoices, cut-off dates. Again, next financial year, few months invoices so that those have been dispatched, goods have been dispatched actually from the, and it is not lying with the company itself.
Okay, great, great. Yes,
For expenses, they have been actually debited from the bank accounts. It has been paid, and there are vouchers also for those expenses. We have received those vouchers for those expenses and all these things.
yes, very good. Yes. Anyone else would like to add something more? Anyone? Okay. Absolutely correctly pointed out. When it comes to the fraud, okay, we have to check, we have to look, and as an auditor, there are certain already requirements on us. Okay, there are some responsibilities on us, and we need to fulfill that responsibility. By way of essay 240, we will understand few things. Number one, what to do with respect to fraud. So just now we discussed, like, in this area we need to do this, in this area we need to do that, in this area we need to do that. A lot of things we discussed. But exactly what we have to do, we need to understand that. Number one, what to do. Number two, when to perform those, tasks that is there. Like when to perform what. So whatever we will discuss in this particular item, but when to perform these things. Okay, so when to perform is the second part that we need to understand. And the most and critical part that we need to understand when it comes to the auditor's responsibility relating to the fraud, understanding the responsibility. Okay, understanding the responsibility means who is responsible for what. So who is responsible here? So these are the three elements that we need to understand in detail so that we can understand the auditor's responsibility. Okay, three elements: what, when, and who. What to do, when to perform that particular task, and who is responsible. Okay, now a basic question that I would ask is, can anyone tell me the definition of fraud? Like, what do you mean by fraud?
Intentional error, sir.
Intentional error. Okay, anyone else?
Sir, malicious intentions.
Yep, very good. Yes. Yes, Abrakesh, good. Yes, Yemen, but good,
Dece-
very good.
Deceiving the users of the financial statements intentionally to
In,
get the loans from the financial institutes, deceiving them.
yes, very good. Now tell me one thing, we are discussing what is fraud. But let's say, for example, I'll give you one example and then we will understand in further detail. Okay, so an intentional act to defraud kind of thing. Okay, let's say ABC Private Limited, which is the vendor of XYZ Limited, provided faulty goods on purpose to XYZ Limited. You are being the auditor of XYZ Limited. Okay, you are being the auditor of the XYZ Limited. Kindly comment whether the goods or the faulty goods supplied by ABC Private Limited is fraud or not. Can anyone tell me answer of this? Now there is a ABC Private Limited provided faulty goods on purpose to XYZ Limited. You are the XYZ Limited's auditor. Would you call this particular act as a fraud?
Sir, what is the meaning of on purpose?
Means they knew that the goods are faulty and still they supplied that particular goods. Intentionally, basically, if I talk about intentionally, they supplied faulty goods.
But this does not affect any of the financial position, sir. So it may
Okay.
not be said as fraud in terms of financial statement.
Okay. Anyone else with a different answer? Anyone? Yes, Hemant, very good.
Sir, it is
So,
not a fraud.
okay, it is not a fraud. Absolutely correct. Now, see, there are two things we need to understand when it comes to the fraud. One, an intentional act. Okay, it can be done by one or more individuals, which could be management, those charges governance, employees, third parties. Okay, and here the fraud, when I talk about the fraud, the way it is defined in SA 240, it is that the use of deception to obtain unjust or illegal advantage. If ABC Private Limited is able to get unjust or illegal advantage from the XYZ Limited by use of any of the technique, which may include providing faulty goods intentionally, yes, that is fraud. Now you may say it is not affecting my financial statement. It will affect your financial statement because these are the faulty goods. You will record at the cost, but at the end of the period, the inventory which will be reflected in the financial statement will not be of a good condition. So that inventory might require a provision, and you may not provide the provision because you never knew that the goods are faulty. There are other things subject to other things, inspection, annual check, all those controls are there to detect the particular kind of fraud. So that is detection of the fraud that the management will do by applying controls. Controls like we will check the goods when the goods will come in our go down. We will perform an annual review of the health of inventory. So all these controls, all these procedures are there to identify the fraud or any kind of issue or risk that is there. But that is afterwards. Okay. So yes, I will still call this as a fraud. But there are other things that we need to also understand throughout the session that, okay, once we call this as a fraud, what is the responsibility of the management? What is the auditor's responsibility? Clear? Any doubt till now? Okay, great. So now let's say, for example, you as an auditor are starting an audit of a financial statement. Okay, today let's say you are your friend has approached to you. Okay, please audit the financial statement of my company for financial year 23-24, and you started the audit of financial statement. Now, as an auditor, am I required to question on each and every record that will be presented to me? So my next question is, let's say your friend produced, let's say, bills of purchases for audit. Will you perform additional procedures to verify or to accept that records as genuine? So do I need to perform any additional procedure to call that particular document or to call that particular information that is produced to me by my client as a genuine records? Let's say tomorrow he has produced bills to me, bills of purchase. Will I go and do some additional procedures to check? Okay, no, I have a doubt. I will check each and everything in detail. I just want to make sure these are not fraud bills, or some fake bills presented to me.
Yes, sir, we need to.
Yes, yes, sir. We will be checking, doing additional procedures on it, sir. One thing we
Okay,
can be doing is we are cross-checking with the bills that are uploading in GST. If we get
okay,
genuine bills, the party will be uploading in GST as well.
okay, great. What if the from where we are getting we are purchasing, the vendor is not registered under the GST? Is the
we,
unregistered vendor?
we can get the confirmation of balances from the data data results, the list, what we'll say, balance confirmations, or otherwise we can get the ledger of the party from the vendor. So it
Tell
is
me one thing. Would you do that activity to understand that whether the purchases are genuine, or would you perform that activity to verify the closing balance?
closing balance.
But will you perform some activity or some procedures to check the genuinity or authenticity of the bills or any data that has been given to you?
If it is material amount and generally year end or year beginning bills, there we need to check, because there are generally companies plays gimmick, I mean games for enhancing the balance sheet or profit even.
Yep. Anyone else? Anyone? Yes, Hemant, very good. Yes, Sumit, great. Yes, Prashant. Yes, Pitambar, very good. So, understand just one thing. Uh, Here, when we do an audit, we do not, say that the records are not genuine. So we will not perform procedures to verify the genuinity of authenticity of the records. Understand one thing. Till the time we have identified something. Okay. So conditions applied. I'll do a star mark because conditions applied. Auditor is not required. Is not required. Okay. To question the genuinity, or you can say authenticity, of the records produced to him. I will not question on the authenticity of the records or genuinity of the records. Conditions apply. Why? Reason because let's say terms and conditions is, if I have identified something, if I have identified something different, which is pointing out towards that, okay, this is fake or this is not genuine, this is not authentic. So I have identified something different which is pointing out towards, okay, there is an issue with these records or this particular vendor or this particular documents. Then only I will go and I will perform the procedure. Until and unless, simple, unless I don't have a reason to believe to the contrary, I will I will accept the records and the documents as genuine. Pretty straightforward. I will not question on the documents. Reason because today if I say, let's say purchase bill, I doubt on this purchase bill. I have no comfort over the purchase bill. I need verification statement from the vendor. What if the verification statement from the vendor is fake? You will then say, no, I doubt on the verification statement that has been received by the vendor. I doubt the vendor is even not genuine. I doubt the person sitting over is a, the person who is replying as a vendor is not a genuine person. He's a fake and he's some related party of the client. There is no end to the depth that we are talking about over here. Absolutely correct, Abrakesh. There is no end, to question on the genuinity if we start that process. Here we are required to do the audit. We are not the forensic accountant or fraud investigators. We are the auditors. There is a difference between both of them, and that we need to understand that while doing the audit, we are required to provide reasonable assurance rather than doing a forensic accounting or fraud investigation and go in depth, understand, analyze how the fraud has happened, what was done in the fraud. No, that is not our job as of now. Tomorrow, if you get a forensic accounting or fraud investigation assignment, different story. But today you are an auditor. Provide reasonable assurance with respect to the financial statement. And when we provide reasonable assurance, we talk about, okay, what was there in the books of accounts is appropriately getting reflected in the financial statement or not. So we say that, okay, the financial statement, whether they are providing true or fair picture of the books of accounts or not. Okay, so accordingly, true and fair basis, we need to perform our procedures. Clear? Any doubt? So these are the few things we need to understand before we deep dive into the standard. We need to understand what is our responsibility. So when I talk about who is responsible, we need to understand that yes, management is the responsible person. Okay, management has a responsibility to prevent and detect the fraud, not the auditor. That's why we will not do any such procedures, like going into in-depth fraud investigation, forensic accounting. No, management is responsible for that. So on sample basis, yes, Sumit, we will include fraud element in our risk assessment. I will discuss that in detail. So when I say terms and conditions apply, there is another part that we need to discuss, that what to do. I cannot just plain right away say, okay, I will not do with respect to fraud anything. I will do something. That what something is there, that we need to understand. Any doubt? Any doubt, guys? Yes, I'll come to that, Hemant. Don't worry. Yes, Abrakesh. Okay, so let's understand first what we are required to do. When it comes to the fraud element in respect to the audit of financial statement, the first part we need to understand what we are required to do. Okay, we are not required to question on the genuinity, but apart from that, there should be something that we should do. And that is, I will explain one by one. So you can say section is what to do. So the first thing that we need to do when it comes to the fraud, okay, the auditor's responsibility is to make inquiries and to consider fraud element while performing the risk assessment procedures. Okay, so what we are required to do is, first we will perform the inquiries with the management. Inquiries with the management. Now what inquiries we are required to do? Can anyone tell me? Okay, what inquiries I'm talking about over here? What type of inquiries we will do with the management? What we will inquire with the management? Anyone? Okay, Abrakesh, yes. Sumit, great. Okay, tell me, who is the responsible person to prevent and detect the fraud? Yes, Sumit, management is the person. Management is the responsible to prevent and detect the fraud. So will I not ask management, how can you be so sure that you say this financial statement does not have fraud in it? I will ask management that your responsibility is to prevent and detect. Have you prevented and detected the fraud? Have you considered whether there is a fraud in this financial statement or not? Let's say there is a big MNC with 2000 employees. I go to the CFO and I ask, CFO, tell me one thing, this financial statement you are giving to me, if tomorrow someone out of the 2000 employees park and post a fraud manual journal entry, how will you identify? Out of the thousands of journal entries, how will you identify these 3 journal entries are fraudulent? So how you have considered or whether you have prevented or detected the fraud? How can you be so sure? That is the first thing I will ask. And in other terms, if I say, I will ask the management, okay, whether in your assessment of risk, have you considered the fraud? And if you have considered the fraud, then how? Okay. So first thing I will ask is whether management has considered the risk that the financial statements may be materially misstated due to fraud. Okay. So whether management has considered the risk that the financial statement may be materially misstated due to fraud, or in simple terms, whether is there any fraud in your financial statement. Now, why we have to write this long term? Understand one thing. This particular term, risk that the financial statement may be materially misstated due to fraud. Risk of fraud, basically if you see, this is nothing but we are talking about risk of fraud. Okay, which we are talking about material risk of fraud in a financial statement. Now in exam also, when you are writing your answers, you have to be careful. You have to focus upon that. Okay, you are writing the correct and appropriate term that is relevant in the context. For example, this particular part, that risk that the financial statement may be materially misstated due to fraud, I can write in 10 different ways. For example, that fraud in financial statement, or I can write fraud risk, or I can write, you can say, material misstatement due to fraud. But all these terms are incorrect because they do not depict the clear understanding that we want to show. For example, fraud in financial statement, we are talking about in definitive terms. Okay, there is a fraud in financial statement. No, your answer may appear incorrect in that case. Or if I talk about fraud risk, but what fraud risk? Where fraud risk? So fraud risk in financial statement, or risk that the financial statement are materially misstated, that is a fraud risk. Okay, kind of a short form we are doing, but that will again change the understanding of the sentence and the answer at times. Material misstatement due to fraud, we are talking about actual material misstatement. So whenever you write the exam, please pay attention to the terms that are critical, and try not to change the terms that are there. Okay, and understand what we are writing. Reason, because once you will understand what you are writing or what you are reading, it will make the topic more clear. So we are talking about risk that the financial statements are materially misstated due to fraud. If they were not materially misstated, then why I would be bothered? If there was no material misstatement due to fraud, if the fraud due to fraud, if let's say for example, I'm doing the audit of a company with a 10,000 crore revenue, and someone passed a manual journal entry of 200 rupees, which is fraudulent manual journal entry, may not be material for me. I might not be that pick that particular part as a sample or consider in my testing. Very less chances. So in that case, I would not consider that as a very big issue, because that is not a material. Till the time you have a very small to 200 entries, multiple entries, making it together as a material chunk. Okay, clear? So the first thing I will inquire with the management, whether management has considered the risk of the fraud or not. Second, what I will ask from management? Can anyone tell me, apart from this, what I will ask from management? Anyone?
If any fraud detected, what are the steps they have taken to avoid that in this assessment?
Very good. Yes, absolutely correct. So, whether management's process, like management itself will not go to each and every department and verify the vouchers, but they will set up some processes, okay, for identifying and detecting the fraud, for preventing and detecting the fraud. So now we will ask management, tell me one thing, whether your process, that's the management's process, for identifying and responding to the risk of fraud, okay, to the risk of fraud, including any specific risk that is there, has brought or has identified okay, any kind of you can say account balances, transaction, disclosure, for which there is a likely or for which there is a fraud or there is a chances of fraud, not only fraud but even chances of fraud. So whether that process has identified any transactions, balances, disclosures, okay, for which a risk of fraud is likely to exist. So after performing your procedures, have you identified such areas where even I'm not asking the actual fraud, but even the risk of fraud is there? For example, management might think, okay, we have not identified any actual fraud, but there is chances that in this area there could be fraud involved, but we have still not identified. Third, that I will ask management, have you communicated, okay, whether management's communication, now communication to who? Communication to any authority, any regulatory body, okay, or to those charged with governance, let's say audit committee. So I will ask management in your communication, so management's communication with relevant stakeholders, okay, with stakeholders, have you reported any fraud? So kind of if you have identified any fraud, then have you reported or not? And the last part is, I would ask management regarding policies, procedures that management communicate to its employees. Okay, policies and procedures regarding business practice and ethical behavior communicated to employees. Now why I will do the last step, reason because that will make me understand what is the tone at the top, how management is serious about, to prevent and detect the fraud. Let's say management is, highly bothered, highly, conscious about the fraud in the organization. So that's why what management is doing is frequently, let's say on a monthly basis, management asks their employees to perform all the tasks ethically, to comply with the ethical behaviors, to comply with the ethical policies of the company. So management is very much conscious about particular that fact. So that will kind of also serve as a tone at the top. So I will understand what is the tone at the top. So that is the first part that we need to understand. Okay, we will perform the inquiries with the management. Yes, Sumit, I'll come on to your part. Yes, Abhakesh, I will come to on to your part. That is the second part I'm talking about. Any doubt till now? So, should I perform inquiries with someone else or inquiries with the management is fine? Do I consider, am I required to perform inquiries with someone else, or am I required to speak with someone else in the organization to understand whether they have identified any fraud or not? Anyone?
Those charged with governance, sir.
Sorry?
Those charged with governance.
Okay. Those charged with governance. Anyone else that you might think, okay, I should go and speak to them, that understand whether they have identified any fraud or not? Sumit, ADT4 is something with respect to the reporting of fraud. Yes, Hemant, very good. Yes, Ginny, very good. So, as you guys said, absolutely correct, internal auditor. Okay, I will ask the internal audit function if present. Okay, internal audit function. I will inquire with the internal audit function if they have any knowledge of sorry, just a minute, there is some system issue. Yeah, I will perform inquiries with internal audit function okay, I will perform inquiries with the internal audit function to understand whether they have any knowledge of any actual, suspected or alleged fraud. So three type of fraud: actual, suspected or alleged fraud affecting the entity. Okay, so I will ask them, do you know about any actual suspected or alleged fraud? Actual means that has happened. Suspected means they suspect, but the investigation or detailed understanding or analysis is not being done, or actual identification is still pending, but they suspect there could be a fraud. Alleged fraud is means someone has done a whistleblowing. They have some complaints, but the investigation has still not happened to substantiate the fraud. So allegations are there about the fraud, but investigation has not been is yet to be done. So actual suspected or alleged fraud. Now the question is not only internal audit, but should I go to other departments also? Let's say, for example, there's a procurement department, there's a treasury department, there is other employees in the company. Should I go to them also, or should I only restrict to internal audit function? What do you say? Should I go to other departments? So let's say, for example, a company has 2000 employees. Should I ask each and every employee, or should I ask only selected employees? Okay, Yogesh. Okay, Abrakesh. Okay, Hemant. And any specific reason for the you, if you are giving answer that okay, selected employees, not the all the employees. Any specific reason?
Because all employees are not, I mean, allowed to access the system or anything. But certain employees which have authority to process the transaction or approve the transaction. So we should go to selected employees, not all, or those who are involved in the particular transaction where we have an indication of doubt. I mean fraud.
Okay. Okay. Uh, let's say, for example, even if that employee is not having any access to the system, do you don't think that do you think that that employee might be having any information about the fraud if it is related to any physical operations like warehouse, inventory warehousing, or
Yes,
inventory movement?
yes.
So should I ask each and every employee or select it still?
Not all, but alleged fraud, those who are connected with the alleged fraud transaction, even at the clerical level also.
Okay, understood. So anyone else with any other answer? Anyone else? Okay, in that case, uh, I would not go with the selected. I may inquire with others also. Okay, and there is no need to restrict the inquiries for the selected employees. I may ask others also, like others include my operating personals, then you may say employees who are head of a department, employees involved in complex transaction, then in-house legal counsel, okay, ethics officer if any, or uh, person dealing in fraud, means if the company has a fraud investigator. So I will ask all these people, not only restricted to any internal audit or some specific. I may ask anyone in the organization. If I feel that person has the information, I may ask that person, please provide me the information, or if you do you think that you have any information about the fraud. So there is no restriction when it comes to the inquiry with respect to the fraud. You can inquire with the internal audit, you can inquire with the others, you can inquire with the management.
Sir, it is like whistleblowing.
Yes, let's say for example, yeah, but I'm not asking them to go and whistleblow somewhere else. If they have any knowledge, then give it to me. Any doubt?
So what about terminated employee? Suppose, for example, as that person is told as whistleblower. Now, because of his action, he might have been terminated, sacked from the organization. Can we go and check with him also?
Going beyond or speaking to a terminated employee could be a challenging task. I'll tell you the reason why. Because currently he's the employee of some another company. Okay, in that case it may not appear legally, because there are some legal restrictions also, that you are coordinating or you are contacting a person who is working in some other company, and there are other legal ramifications in that area. That's why we do not go beyond that, in case of a terminated employee.
Okay.
Any doubt? So these are the things we need to perform. One is the inquiry with the management. Second is the inquiry with the internal audit function and others. Third is the evaluation of fraud risk factors. Evaluation of fraud risk factors. Now, can someone tell me what are the fraud risk factors? Can someone tell me what are the fraud risk factors? Or if anyone can give me an example of fraud risk factors. Anyone?
Sir, deficiency in internal control system.
Yes, that is a fraud risk factor. Very good. Anyone else?
Resignation of topmost positions like directors or the TCWG.
Could be, yes.
And resignation of the auditor can also be a reason.
But usually we ask for the, in professional ethics, we just now saw that before, getting appointed as an auditor, we ask from the previous auditor the reason for the resignation, or, if there is anything we should not be joining or we should not accept this engagement as an auditor. So in that, usually we get that particular idea. Anyone else?
Higher attrition rate.
Okay, yes. Good. More incentive given by the company to do the fraud. Incentive as in, Ginny, can you explain this one? Okay, I'll tell you. Usually there could be a multiple fraud risk factors, but all the fraud risk factors are divided in three categories. One is an incentive or pressure to commit the fraud. Second is an opportunity to commit the fraud. And third is a rationalization. That is a motive, or the reason which gives a person that okay, you should commit the fraud. That how he is able to rationalize with the fraud, or do with the doing the fraud. Let's say, for example, when I talk about rationalization, let's say someone is posting fake purchase bills to take out the money or to siphon the funds from the company. Now rationalization means that how the person is justifying that act. Okay, company is not giving me enough salary, I'm working hard, but company is not giving me promotion, or there is a lot of pressure that I should be getting more money, something like that, and this is appropriate in the circumstance to do, and that's why I'll do the fraud. So that is a rationalization. Fraud risk factors, these are the three fraud risk factors, or basically you also call it the fraud triangle: incentive, opportunity, and rationalization, which gives, or whenever these three factors are present, there are high chances that there would be a fraud. So there are then high chances that there would be fraud. Clear? So usually we also know this as a fraud triangle: incentive, opportunity, and rationalization. Fraud triangle. Okay. So understanding the fraud risk factors or evaluation of the fraud risk factors is the responsibility of the auditor. Now we are required to evaluate fraud risk factors when we are required, or when we are performing the risk assessment. Now we will jump to the second part, is that when to perform. We understood we are required to perform inquiries. We understood we are required to consult with internal auditors. We understood that we are required to evaluate fraud risk factors, but when? That is the second point now we need to understand. So I'll keep some space because I need to add something more to the what to do, but let's start from here. When to do. So the first part, that is when to do, is response, creating a response, or understanding this whole scenario when we are performing the risk assessment. Basically, identification and assessment of risk of material misstatement due to fraud. Okay. Now, very important term that we need to understand over here. Very important term. That is risk of material misstatement due to fraud. Risk of material misstatement due to fraud. Now, some might write it as a fraud risk, but this is very important term. Remember that. Why important term? Because I do not generally write fraud risk in exam. Whenever you want to write in exam, whenever you want to write an answer, understand that you need to write the whole term so that it should have the appropriate meaning. If I remove a single word from this term, the meaning will change. If I say material misstatement due to fraud, I'm talking about actual material misstatement. If I talk about risk of material misstatement, it can be due to anything. That's why I need to write risk of material misstatement due to fraud. That is a fraud risk in other terms. In a short way, we say that, but in exam, you have to write this full term. Important part, risk of material misstatement due to fraud. Okay, now these can be this particular, I call it risk of material misstatement due to fraud, can be at a financial statement level or the assertion level. So first of all, I need to identify that at the financial statement and the assertion level. Risk of material misstatement due to fraud. I will write the abbreviation, but in exam do not use abbreviations. Financial statement level and assertion level. So I need to identify and assess the risk of fraud at these two levels. Okay. Now I need to understand, when I talk about financial statement level or assertion level, can anyone tell me the difference? What is a financial statement level? What is assertion level? Why there are two things I'm writing here? What is the difference between both?
Financial level statement means it is before approval of management. In assertion level, once it has been signed.
Once
Approved.
it is approved, okay. Anyone else?
Which is material in terms of financial statement as financial statement level, where there is fraud, but it will not affect my financial statement materially or assertion level.
Okay. Anyone else?
So financial statement level means after the transaction is done and before finalization of accounts.
And
And
assertion
assertion level means at the inception or means the transaction itself.
Okay. Anyone further would like to add something on this? What is assertion level? What is financial statement level? Okay, can anyone tell me how many assertions are there? Very good, Ginny. Yes. Can anyone tell me how many assertions are there? See. Okay, I'll tell you. Now, when I talk about assertion level, okay, it could be either at the, again, divided in three categories: transaction level, account balance level, or disclosure level. Now, can anyone tell me how many assertions are there at the transaction level? Okay, I'll give you number also. Let's say there are 5 assertions. I'll give you number. there are 5 assertions. At the transaction level, at the account balance level, there are 4 assertions. And at the presentation and disclosure level, again there are 4 assertions. Now can anyone tell me the name of those assertions?
Complete,
Yes, you are going correct.
occurrence, complete,
Mm.
cutoff,
Yes,
I remembered only those.
perfectly fine. Yes, absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. So when I talk about transaction level assertions, so there are 5: occurrence, completeness, accuracy, cutoff, classification. Okay. When I talk about balance sheet level, there are existence, right in obligation, completion, valuation. And when I talk about presentation disclosure, again occurrence, completeness, classification, and accuracy. Okay, so these are the assertions at the each level. Now, what are these assertions? What I'm talking about, occurrence, completeness, what is that? Let me explain with a quick example. Let's say when I talked about transaction level, I discussed 5 assertions: occurrence, completeness, accuracy, cutoff, and classification. Okay, I generally call this as a OCACC. OCACC. That is the transaction level assertions. Now, what are these assertions? What that means? Let us take one example. Let us take one transaction. Now, transaction is purchase account debit to vendor account 100. Let's say this is a general entry or this is a particular transaction. Now, when I talk about occurrence, what do you think? Occurrence would be related to this particular transaction. What do you think? Occurrence will be about this particular transaction. This page.
Actually, the purchase have been done. It has been occurred. The incident event has been occurred.
Okay. Yes. Correct. Yes, Hemant. Very good. So when I talk about occurrence of this particular transaction, okay, occurrence means that transaction has really happened. I'll just drag just below. Occurrence means that transaction has really happened. Means that purchase, I have really made that purchase. In actual, this is not a fake fraud entry. That is a real entry I'm talking about. What about completeness? What do you mean by completeness?
Double entry system, sir.
Yes. Okay. Anyone else?
All the purchases have been recorded in that financial year completely.
Yes, absolutely correct. All aspects of the transaction, when I talk about the transaction, means all aspects of the transaction has been fully recorded. So let's say understand completeness means that transaction has been completely recorded. And when I talk about an account balance, or listing of an account balance or listing of some transactions, I say let all the purchases have been completely recorded. There is nothing which have been missed out. What about accuracy?
Value of the transaction is correct.
Absolutely correct. So when I talk about this number 100, this is actually 100. This is not 19, 80, 85, 87, 99, whatever. Amount is accurate. What about cutoff?
Pertaining to that financial period that we are auditing.
Yes, absolutely correct. So basically, if I talk about the date of this transaction, let's say 31/12/2023. So the date, based on the date, I have recorded this transaction in a correct year. I have not jumped the financial year. So let's say, for example, this transaction is of December. I recorded in the next financial year. I did not record in the current financial year. So the cutoff procedures have been applied appropriately, that the transactions and event have been recorded in the correct accounting period. Correct accounting period. Now, what about classification?
Respective accounts heads. If purchase of something, whether it is purchase or it is an inventory or it is an asset, particular classification.
Absolutely correct. So when I use this purchase account, is this a purchase or an expense? Is this a vendor or a customer? Is this something else, some other party, related party, owner? So the classification of the accounts is proper or not, whether I am using correct or proper accounts or not. Using proper accounts. So these are the transaction level assertions. When I say I need to assess the risk of material misstatement due to fraud at the assertion level, means I need to think about the fraud at this particular level: occurrence, completeness, accuracy, cutoff or classification. For example, cutoff. Let's say I may think, okay, there are chances of that someone might post an entry in the wrong accounting period intentionally. Okay, so for example, I have made a lot of sales in the month of April, but to show good results in the March month, or to show good results in this current financial year, I preponed those entries. I changed the date. Cutoff procedures were not applied. So having risk of fraud at the cutoff level of particular transaction, that is an assertion level. Or let's say completeness. Let's say there are expenses in the current year. I did not record full expenses to show good profit. So risk of fraud at the completeness level, that is at the assertion level. So whenever I have to think about the fraud, identification and assessment of risk of fraud, okay, risk of material misstatement due to fraud at the assertion level, I am talking about this level. It may be related to account balance, it may be related to the transaction level, or it may be related to the disclosures. Same way for the transaction level, for the account balance level, I have following assertions. That is existence, rights and obligation, completeness, and valuation. Okay, so when I talk about existence, means that balance actually exists. Rights and obligations means I hold a right or an obligation. When I say asset, so I hold a right to use that asset. When I say obligation, it comes in the case of liability, that I have an obligation to pay that liability. In actual, I have an obligation. Okay, kind of, you can say accuracy point of view. Then completeness, again, which is we discussed in that particular transaction level, completeness. Then you have a valuation. Again, valuation means the amount of asset and liability or whatever it is recorded is accurate. Again, related to something which is accurate or not, accuracy. And there are assertions with respect to the presentation and disclosure, which are again on the similar lines. One is the occurrence, completeness, classification, and accuracy. When I use accuracy, okay, I also use here valuation, because for the asset or liability I use the valuation, for the transactions I use the term accuracy. And when I talk about transactions I use the term occurrence, but when I talk about the term let's say account balances or something more, it may be your rights and obligations or existence. Okay, so these are the assertions for presentation and disclosure. Clear? Any doubt? What are assertions? And when I talk about identifying risk of material misstatement due to fraud at the assertion level, now you should be understanding that what I'm talking about. Any doubt? Okay, great. Now I understood when I'm required to do, okay, at the time of performing risk assessment. But there should be something more, that okay, I have identified the risk. Now what to do? I based on the inquiries, based on the evaluation of fraud risk factors, I perform the risk assessment. Whatever inquiry I did, whatever assessment I did, I performed the risk assessment, and I have now, let's say for example, some risk identified. So what next I will do? I identified the risk till now, whatever I have done. And if I talk about till here, it was planning stage. This is planning stage. This whole, whatever we have discussed, what to do, is planning stage. Now what? Am I required to do anything further beyond planning stage? This will be beyond planning stage. Am I required to do anything?
Communicate, sir.
Yes.
Communicate
To whom?
to management
And communication regarding?
regarding the assessment of fraud, what we have done.
Okay. Okay. Very good. Yes, it's there. I will communicate with the management, but there are further things. I will take up that point at a later stage. Communication with the management, because we need to communicate something more.
We have to get reassured ourselves that identification is proper, correct.
Collect more evidence, appropriate audit evidences to back up our findings.
Yes, very good. Very good. So that means we have to do some audit procedures now. And in other terms, I call this particular part as an responses to the assessed risk of material misstatement due to fraud. Means Whatever we have assessed till now, till planning stage, that is the assessed risk. Now that risk has converted into the assessed risk of material misstatement due to fraud. Earlier I was only using the term, this term, risk of material misstatement due to fraud. I added one more word now, that is assessed. That means that risk has been now finalized. Okay, I assess that risk, I am confirmed that risk is there. Okay, now I need to create response to that risk. Responses. This is very important part. Responses. Now what are these responses? These responses are nothing but the audit procedures you will determine in front of each risk. Audit procedures you will perform in front of each assessed risk. And that is done as per, this is done as per SA 330. Okay, this is done as per SA 330. What is SA 330? Can anyone tell me? Can anyone tell me what is SA 330? Come on, guys. SA 330. Yes, Jenny, very good. SA 330 in general provides that what audit procedures auditor will perform in front of each and every assessed risk. So that talks about the auditor's response to the assessed risk. Not only fraud risk, but all type of risk. When I talk about that, what auditor response should be there in front of all risk, including fraud risk, SA 330 helps me to identify and to perform that activity. Okay, so when I will do this, creating the response as per SA 330, I will also create a response as per for the fraud risk. Clear? Any doubt? Not only SA 240 and 330 will go hand to hand, but this will also go together. This identification and assessment is part of my SA 315. So I will do identification as per SA 315, then I will create a response as per SA 330. And there are three specific things I will do along with creating the response. One, appropriate allocation, evaluation of accounting policy, and third part is incorporating unpredictability. So appropriate allocation of work, evaluating accounting policies, and incorporating unpredictability. These are the three things I will do over and above assessing, creating the response. And while creating the response, I need to think about these three factors, you can say. So this is nothing but my factors or important points to be considered while deciding the response as per SA 330. Now, what are these 3 points? Number 1, assigning or appropriate allocation of work. Can I allocate, let's say for example, after doing the risk assessment, I identified no, in revenue there is a high risk of fraud. So there was one employee in my firm, in my audit team, who was freshly joined. He never did any audit in previous jobs. Rather, he was a fresher. I allocated him the audit of revenue, that particular area where I assess the high risk. Do you think it is appropriate? No. Yes, absolutely. Correct, Anila, Yogesh. It's not appropriate. I have to allocate the work by understanding the knowledge, skill, and ability of the team members, and accordingly, I will allocate the areas of the work. Evaluation of accounting policy means I will check which are the accounting policies, either which are not aligned with my AS or NDS. Number 2, they are too much complex, so that they are so much complex that there are high chances that someone might play a might do a fraud or might commit an error, which are where the management judgment is involved, kind of highly judgmental accounting policies. For example, a lot of accruals, a lot of provisions, or percentages that are decided by the management. So if there is some accounting policies which are very complex, where management judgment is involved, I need to look into that for sure. And third is in incorporating unpredictability. Can anyone explain me what is that? Very important area. Can anyone tell me what is unpredictability?
While performing the audit in the due course, unpredictably, they might be getting some evidence later on.
Okay. Very good, Hemant. When I say unpredictability, it is something like, client never predicted that we will do this. Usually, client or management is of the opinion that we will check material items which are material to the financial statement, or transactions which are material to the financial statement. They are of the opinion every time that we will not look into non-material items, or items which are of not that much importance, or small value items, or items where we think there is very less chance of fraud. Those are unpredicted areas. If you incorporate unpredictability, means you incorporate testing of those areas. Somewhat testing. I'm not talking about total unpredictability, but somewhat element. Let's say I'm talking about testing 50 samples. Out of 50 samples, I will pick up 5 samples of small value, or of those areas which are, let's say, where there is very less chance of fraud. In my risk assessment, the fraud risk was very low, or even there was no risk. That is unpredictability, doing what was not predicted by the management. Clear? So I will think about these 3 things when I will create a response for the fraud risk. Any doubt till now? Any doubt? Can you please tell me on the disclosure level? Assertions? So assertions at the disclosure, presentation and disclosure level are occurrence, completeness, classification and accuracy. Any further doubts? No? Okay. If no further doubts, let's take a quick 10-minute break. After the break, we'll gather back and continue the session and we'll discuss in further details. Let's take a quick 10-minute break. Thank you, sir. about that when to do was done. Then we discussed about creating a response and some important matters that are required to be taken care while creating a response. Okay. Now there are two important aspects that I want to specifically discuss on this. Is that when we will create a response or when we will perform risk assessment, that this one identification assessment of the risk, there are two risks that we will take care or we will assume that they are there. So presumption of the risk, kind of, you can say. This is presumed risk of fraud. This is presumed risk of fraud. These are the two ones. One is risk of fraud in revenue recognition that by default I will assume that there is a fraud risk in revenue recognition. Number two, very important part, risk of fraud with respect to management override of controls. Risk of fraud related to management override of controls. Let's understand both of the presumed risk in detail. When I'm talking about risk of fraud, okay, that the revenue will not be recorded appropriately, rather there will be a issue in the revenue recognition. When I say presumed risk, means that by default I assume that there is going to be a fraud risk. By default I assume that there is a fraud risk in this. And the reason because I assume there is a fraud risk because, you know, revenue is a very critical area from the financial statement point of view. So to have that importance of the revenue, okay, premature revenue recognition, fictitious revenue recognition, we understand or we presume from the start itself that there is a fraud risk. Now someone might question me that, okay sir, but based on our risk assessment we did not identify any revenue fraud risk in revenue. Let's say there is one entity, the role of entity is just to provide some, you know, properties on rent, and the revenue is the rent received. Now we can understand based on the contract what rent should be received, and they are receiving that rent. Very small entity, or you know, revenue is pretty much simple. Rather we think fraud is in the expense side, maintaining the properties. So should we still go and record fraud, risk of fraud in revenue recognition? What do you say, guys? Is it necessary or compulsory that I record risk of fraud in revenue recognition? I'm saying that is a presumed risk. That presumed risk means that when I start my risk assessment, I have to consider revenue recognition as a fraud risk. Do you still think that is it necessary that every time I have to consider this as a fraud risk? Even though when the revenue is very pretty straightforward or simple, let's say company is a startup, there is no revenue in the first year. Still will I go and say risk of fraud in revenue recognition? Yes, no? What do you think? Anyone? So, yes, Abhakesh, yes, Anila, good. So, risk of fraud in revenue recognition, when I say presumed risk, at the start of risk assessment, yes, I consider this as a fraud risk, but not necessary at the end of the risk assessment also, I consider this as a fraud risk. This is for the starting point. I would keep a references. This is starting point, or this is at the start of risk assessment. But not necessary that at the end of the risk assessment, when I'll complete my risk assessment, I will still say there is a risk of fraud. In that case, the presumption that there are risk of fraud in revenue recognition may be rebutted. Okay. So, the presumption can be rebutted. Now, what that means? Sometimes, what do you say? Some students have doubts. What do you mean by reboot? Okay. So that means, this means that to claim or to prove that something is false or kind of reverse, okay, repeal, kind of, so we can, presumption can be rebutted. That presumption can be considered as a false or can be reversed based on the details that you obtain during the risk assessment. Are you getting my point? Let's say, for example, simple type of revenue is there, rent revenue. Okay, that I receive. I have two properties. Company has two properties. Both of the properties are given on rent. Every month we receive the rent. There is a rent agreement. Since the last 5 years we are receiving the rent. There is no pressure, small entity or something like that. Yes, I can still go ahead and say that, okay, earlier there was at the start of the risk assessment, there was a presumed risk, but now at the end of the risk assessment, I'm saying that, okay, the presume or the presumption has been rebutted. Reason, because the revenue is pretty much straightforward, simple. There is no complexity involved. There is no fraud element or chances of fraud element involved. Hence, I'm saying there is no risk of fraud in that. Perfectly possible. You need to only take care of one more thing, that is plus documentation. Whatever reasoning, whatever logic you say, based on which you say it's a rebutted, document that appropriately. Okay, that is the risk of fraud in revenue recognition. Let's talk about the second part, management override of controls. Can anyone tell me what that means, management override of controls? What is management override of controls?
Bypassing some controls which are meant to prevent the fraud, but since the management has the power at the top level, they are bypassing those controls so that they can the chances of doing the fraud.
Okay. Absolutely correct.
Going against policy.
Going against policy, yes, absolutely correct. Anyone else?
Management wantedly doing that, means ignoring the controls.
Yes, very good. Absolutely correct. So when I talk about management override of controls, see, who is the one who design and implement the control? Management. So let's say tomorrow management designs the control in such a way that they have the power to override it. Override means to bypass that. For example, management created a control that whenever the goods are coming into the warehouse, someone is checking that goods. Now let's say that control was designed by the CEO of the company. Okay, that instructions were given by the CEO of the company. Tomorrow, let's say CEO of the company comes on the ground in the warehouse and some goods comes in and says to the employee, okay, do not check these goods, directly keep in the warehouse. What the employee will do? Whether they will go ahead and do the quality check even after specific instruction from the CEO, or they will listen to the CEO. Any given employee will listen to the CEO, because creating a policy is also done by a CEO. Now then, giving a specific instruction is also by the CEO. Tomorrow, if that employee will not listen to the CEO, then the CEO might fire that employee. Pretty straightforward. Listen to me or otherwise get out, like this way. So management are in that unique position that they can, bypass anything, any control that they have designed. As a result, what is the scenario is, I assume that there is a fraud risk in that. Because of that power that the management has, I will assume that there is a fraud risk. The way I have rebutted risk of fraud in revenue, can I rebut this risk also? Yes or no? Okay, Hemant. Can I rebut this also the way I have done with the revenue recognition? Yes or no? I say that, okay, in some kind of entities where there is no revenue, simple revenue, there are less chances of risk of fraud. Can I say that for this also management override of controls? Anyone? Come on, guys. Okay, tell me one thing or one particular company where I would say, okay, management is not having that much power to override the controls. Is it possible to, have a company where management is not having a power to override the controls? Is there any entity where I would say, okay, management is not having any power to override the controls? Yes, no, anyone? Anila, Abrakesh, Hemant?
Government entity.
Okay. Even in the government entities, so the directors, CEO of the company, managing director, they will still have the power. See, power to approve transaction, power to run day-to-day operations, power to execute the policy, draft the policies is not, only restricted to that. Those powers can be misused to override the controls. So there is no specific power for overriding the controls. This is something, a byproduct of the power that the management has to run the company. So when I say management doesn't have a power to override the control, I'm at the first stage, I'm saying management doesn't have a power to run the company. Then what is the use of management? In that case, there is no company where I would say, okay, management doesn't have a power to override the control. Otherwise, they are not even management. We call them as a management because they are in such a position that they have that power, okay, that ability. Now in that case, irrespective of auditor's assessment, again I will use the word irrespective of the auditor's assessment, of risk, I will perform some specific testing. One will be the test of appropriateness of manual journal entries. Test of appropriateness of manual journal entries. Because if management will utilize their power, they will do through journal entries. Okay, so I will check the appropriateness of the journal entries recorded in the journal ledger and other adjustment that the management has recorded. I will check their appropriateness, whether they are appropriate or not. Second, I will review accounting estimate. For management biasness, okay, and I will evaluate whether they are appropriate or not. And how will I do that? Whether they are appropriate or not, I will do based on SA 540. As per SA 540. By using the SA 540, I will review the accounting estimates, or also I will test the manual journal entries. Irrespective of the auditor's assessment, whether I say there is fraud risk or not or whatever, I will do these two things. Important, remember that. Irrespective of auditor's risk of assessment, I will perform these testings. Clear? Any doubt? And other things, let's say for example, this is when I say okay, irrespective of the test, assessment, but when I assess there is a higher risk, I may perform additional procedures based on the risk. So we understood what to do and when to do. Okay, so what to do is, we understood that 315, 330, both of the things. 315, SA 315 plus 330, okay, and some additional testing. Now when to do this all stuff? At the time of SA 315 or planning. And we also discussed who is responsible for the what, like we discussed that management is responsible for prevention and detection of fraud. So we discussed these three important elements: what to do, when to do, or who is responsible. And as an auditor, what we are responsible for. doubt till now? After understanding all these things, any doubt? We will also do audit evidence analysis. Like let's say this is something we discussed that okay, after planning, beyond planning stage, okay, response and everything, and testing of this particular presumed risk. Okay, now once the planning stage is over, or testing stage is also over, beyond planning stage but till testing stage, this was testing or collection of audit evidence. This is collection of evidence. Okay. Now, once you do a collection of evidence, then what? At the time of planning, we understood. At the time of collection of evidence, we understood. Now, beyond collection, there is evaluation and conclusion. Evaluation and conclusion of audit evidence. Whatever evidence you have gathered, that we will understand and we will evaluate that evidence. So, evaluate the evidence, identify the misstatement, identify the misstatement, and its impact over the audit opinion. So you need to identify the misstatement and its impact over the audit opinion. Simple. Whether it's material, it's not material, what is the thing, whether any further testing required or not. All that stuff you will do in the evaluation phase. Now, let's suppose you identified a fraud and suddenly management is not providing you any of the data. Management has blocked your accesses in the system, in the premises, just because you identified the fraud. What you will do? Anyone? What you will do in that case?
Discuss the matter with those charged with governance.
Let's say they are also not replying to you.
Modified opinion as per SA 700.
Okay. See, when you identify or come across exceptional circumstances that management not responding to you, they are not providing you the data, in that case it becomes very difficult also to issue the opinion. In that case, we may decide not to continue with the engagement. Okay, we may decide not to continue the engagement, though there are few things that we need to understand that we will be required to do. In exceptional circumstances, we may decide not to continue. Auditor may unable to continue. The engagement, and he may consider what are the legal ramifications of withdrawing, may seek legal advice, check his rights and obligations with respect to resignations and withdrawal, and accordingly he needs to take the step. Now, how we can come to know or do audit if there are collusions or if there are problems? See, That's why, let's say if there is a collusion or there is a problem, that should be based on the risk assessment, we might or that might get identified, and that's why we will consider fraud risk factors in our audit. Can auditor give press release regarding this for the exceptional circumstances? Answer is yes and no both, because it's not a pretty straightforward. There are scenarios where you might not have enough evidence, audit evidence, to conclusively say that there is a fraud. Okay, let's say for example, I suspect there is a fraud and I ask management, I have a suspicion that there is a fraud, and management just stop providing me details and everything. I don't have a conclusive evidence. In that case, giving a press release or something, doing something like that is not appropriate. So you need to always seek your legal advice and seek that what are your obligations and rights in the scenario. You may communicate with the management and those charged with governance, okay, unless they are involved into of suspected fraud. Let's say for example, I identified or I suspect a fraud where management is involved, and if I go to management, I think you are involved in fraud, can you provide me your details? They will never provide you the details, because they might be involved in that fraud. So you may consider like whom to communicate, whether management, whether those charged with governance, whether they are involved, not involved. Accordingly, we will communicate these matters to the management or those charged with governance. So it will include communication to those charged with governance / management. But again, as I said, conditions apply, that whether they are involved, that they are not involved. So accordingly, you need to think of whether we can communicate or not. And again, when we are talking about communications, we will refer to SA 260 plus 265. We may also think of communicating the matters to regulatory and enforcement authorities. We may also think of communicating matters to regulatory and enforcement authorities. Best example, ADT4. So there is a ADT4 requirement. There is a requirement to submit if we have a reason to believe that the offense of fraud, which involves or expected to involve an amount, certain amount, has been conducted. Can someone tell me which section of the Companies Act requires this kind of reporting, ADT4? Anyone? Which section of the Companies Act require reporting to the regulatory authority regarding fraud? But which section, Sumit? Yes, Ginny, very good. Yes, Sumit, very good. Yes. Come on, guys. Which section of the Companies Act requires you to report the fraud to regulatory authority? Yes, Ginny, very good. Absolutely correct. Yes, very good. So as per section 143 subsection 12 of the Companies Act requires that the auditor is, when he believes that if he has a reason to believe that an offense of fraud which involves or is expected to involve an amount individually or together of rupees 1 crore or above, okay, has been committed against the company by its officer or employees, then the auditor is required to report the matter to the board, audit committee and to the central government in form ADT 4. That is rule 13 of Companies Audit and Auditors Rule as per section 143(12) of Companies Act. Clear? Any doubt till now? Any doubt? Okay. Now, this was with respect to SA 240 that we discussed. The auditor's responsibility relating to the fraud in an audit of a financial statement. Now, quickly we will go through the module also just to see what is the content, how is there, so that when you will read, you will have an understanding. Okay. So chapter 2 basically covers your SA 240, 250, 260, 99 and 402. Of that, we first started SA 240. This one. The auditor's responsibility relating to the fraud in the audit of a financial statement. You will see the objectives of the auditor in accordance with SA 240. Identify the fraud, identify the risk of material statement in financial statement due to fraud, obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence and to respond. Again, the meaning of fraud we discussed. Okay. Then examples of fraud risk factors. Then fraudulent reporting by the entity. Some examples are given of the fraudulent reporting. Misappropriation of assets, how it can be done. For example, embezzling the receipts, stealing physical asset, causing an entity to pay for goods and service not received, using an entity's personal asset for personal use. Examples of fraud again. Then primary responsibility to prevent and detect the fraud is of those charged with governance and the entity of the management. Entity and the management. So remember who is responsible part. So this is that who is responsible part. Then you have a responsibilities of the auditor basically. So what auditor is required to do, risk factors. Again, remember we discussed about fraud triangle, incentive, pressure. Then you have second part, just a minute, yeah. Incentive and pressure, fraud risk factor, one particular part. Then you have other parts of the fraud risk factor, opportunity, rationalization. Okay, this is the opportunity. Then attitude or rationalization, fraud triangle. And there are examples given, so I will request everyone to go through the examples, because based on the examples you will understand these fraud risk factors. Okay, again, risk factors relating to the misstatement arising from misappropriation of assets. Like there could be different fraud risk factor in different examples or different scenarios. So those are given over here. Incentive, rationalization, and over there you might have opportunities. So these are some examples. Then maintaining professional skepticism, remaining alert, that we discussed. Then you have a risk assessment procedures. We discussed, remember risk assessment procedures as per SA 315. Then responses to the assets risk as per SA 330. SA 330, SA 315. Three important areas that we need to consider, important factors while creating the response. assign and supervise, allocate appropriately. Allocate appropriately. Then evaluate the accounting policies. And third is in unpredictability. Incorporate unpredictability. Okay. Then you have audit procedures with respect to the response risk at the assertion level. So we discussed about the assertions level. Okay. Then related to the management override of controls, we discussed presumed risk. Over there, you are required to do the journal entry testing, accounting estimate, and significant transactions that are outside the normal course of business. Some specific unusual transactions, something is different. Remember we discussed that something is different part. Then evaluate the audit evidence, like understanding the audit evidence that you obtain, its impact on the audit opinion. Then you have a auditor when auditor is unable to continue the engagement. So determine your professional and legal responsibilities, consider whether it's appropriate to withdraw, discuss with the management and governance, subject to condition apply. Okay, if auditor withdraws, then again professional and legal reporting requirements that you have. Then management representations that we are required to obtain. Again, communications part to management and those charged with governance. Remember we discussed about SA 360, SA 260 plus 265 that will be applicable, and communications to regulatory authorities that we discussed section 143(12) of Companies Act. When the fraud is more than of 1 CR, or in other cases responding to the reporting to the RBI, SEBI may be applicable based on the type of entity. So that is the communication part. Then the documentation, and that is the SA 240 in your module that we have discussed. Clear? Any doubt? I would request everyone to read in detail because there are very good examples given of fraud risk factors in the module. Please go through that. Don't miss or skip that reading. It is necessary that you have a read. Once you read the chapter, that is very, very, very important for you guys. Clear? Any doubt? Any doubt, guys? Okay. If no further doubts, then let's take up some questions and discuss those questions. Some of the good questions are there. Let me bring it up. Okay. So let us discuss some questions and their answers so that you can have a good clarity about the topic. Arihant Limited was engaged in the business of owning and managing hotels and resorts, selling tourism packages and performing airline bookings for the corporate and individuals. It appointed Upadhyay and Company as statutory auditor for the financial year 21-22. While planning the audit team decided that the risk of improper revenue recognition from hotel business should not be treated as a fraud risk. This conclusion was based on the assessment of earlier years wherein no fraud was identified in the revenue recorded from such business. While testing the internal financial controls over process of revenue recognition, it was identified that the controls are not properly designed to mitigate the risk of fraud and risk of improper revenue recognition. As a result, the audit team decided to perform additional substantive testing. However, audit team was still were the audit team still were to the conclusion that there is no risk of fraud in the revenue recognition. So they still believe that there is no risk of fraud in revenue recognition. During the course of substantive testing, it was identified that the management does not account for revenue received from corporate hotel bookings amounting to 35 crores. These amounts were partially received in the company's bank account and partially received in the CFO's personal account. The amount received in the bank account of the company were disclosed as advance received against the future bookings. In the light of above scenario, kindly guide the statutory auditor with respect to responsibility relating to the fraud in an audit of a financial statement. So there was some testing which was performed. They identified there is some fraud, but initially based on the risk assessment they said the fraud is not there. So revenue risk of fraud is not there. Now you need to comment with respect to the auditor's responsibility relating to the fraud. I'll give you 2 minutes to read the question again and then answer. Take 2 minutes and read the question again in detail. Come on, guys. Now tell me, what is the auditor's responsibility with respect to the fraud? How will you answer this question? How will you answer this question?
So according to essay that the auditor should presume that there is a risk of fraud in revenue recognition. He can't just based on the previous audits conducted, he can't just ignore that there will not be any risk. So first point that there will be risk. He should audit according to that perspective, and also that controls also to be tested, and the proper what is the steps taken by the management to control that means policies and procedures what they are following to control the risk to revenue recognition, sir.
Okay. Okay. Great. Anyone else? Anyone else? So how will you respond? Yeah. Yes.
Auditors have already identified the fraud after substantive checking. So, I mean, they are supposed to collect the evidences for their findings and then report them to the management or those charged with the governance.
Okay. So communication to the management you are talking about.
Yes.
Great. Okay.
But in this question, if we are supposed to write answers, I mean, with respect to SA 240, for example, all the steps, then we should mention all the steps. Inquiry with management, then substantive checking, or points we have discussed so far.
See, I will come on to that point, how to write an answer in this scenario. I will come to that point in a while. So, how to answer this question, like in an appropriate way. But as per you should, like, the management, the point here is that they should have reported or communicated to the audit, to the management.
Yes.
Okay. Anyone else would like to add something more?
There is an understatement of revenue recognition of 35 crores. It will be impact on the tax liability of the companies also, and also the balance sheet, as it is shown as the advances, the balance sheet figures will also be changing. So it will be having an impact at the financial statements level.
Okay, very good. Yes. Yes, very good. Anyone else?
In other words, it's a misappropriation of the fund by a CFO to the extent of 17.50 crores because it is credited in his personal account.
Yes. Correct. Absolutely. Okay, I'll tell you. Now, what is the correct answer? Basically, see, when I talk about auditor's responsibility relating to the fraud, okay, first of all, we need to understand what auditor did not do appropriately in the question, okay, and then we need to frame an answer on that particular point. First of all, identify and understand what question is saying. In this scenario, here, there was a particular risk assessment performed, and if you focus on this point, that the audit team decided that the risk of improper revenue recognition from hotel business should not be treated as a fraud risk. So, as I said, remember, there is a presumed risk of fraud. This is presumed risk. Yes, that can be rebutted, but you have to document with a specific reason that why you are rebutting, and that is again, your reason should be sufficient enough to demonstrate that okay, there is no risk. Here, what is the reason I would say that has been given? If you see the reason was assessment of earlier years wherein no fraud was identified in revenue recorded. So that was the reason based on which they said, okay, there is no risk of fraud. This is the reason. And while testing revenue, they identified the fraud. So there isn't fraud. Identification is there. Okay. But even before testing, when they did analysis of the internal financial control, or when they were testing the IFC, internal financial controls over a process of revenue recognition, they identified that the controls are not operating effectively, or controls are not designed to mitigate the risk of fraud. Okay, and hence they perform the additional testing, but still the audit team were to the conclusion that there is no risk of fraud. Means, first there was a presumed risk, I removed that, and the reason which was given was not so good. Number two, when I saw controls are not appropriate, when I saw the controls are not appropriate over here, controls are not designed appropriately, still I concluded that there is no risk. I have the evidence in front of me that the controls are not there. Still I go ahead and say there is no risk. And then I identify a fraud. 35 crores fraud. Okay, partially was received, partially was somewhere else, and that stuff. So when I'm going to write the answer, first of all, I will specify what is the requirement of SA 240. Let's see the answer. So first what I will do is I will provide the details about SA 240. Okay, and when I will write the answer, I will code the essay with the name that as per SA 240, auditor's responsibility relating to fraud in a financial statement, plus SA 315, identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatement through understanding the entity and its environment. Remember, I have to apply SA 315 when I'm doing the assessment, identification of the risk as per SA 240. So SA 240 itself says that use SA 315 when you are doing the risk assessment. And over there, I am required to identify risk of fraud. So auditor shall identify the risk of material misstatement due to fraud at the financial statement level and at the assertion level for transaction, account balances and disclosure. Okay. And when I'm identifying, assessing, I need to assume there is a presumption that there is a risk of fraud. There is a presumption there is a risk of fraud that we discussed. Okay, there was a presumed risk, but still I rebutted. But standard says that there is a presumption there is a risk of fraud. Once I assume a risk, I need to create a response as per SA 330. Then I will provide the reference to SA 330. And I will say that, okay, I am required to create a response to address that risk. The presumption may be rebutted as I said, but but when there is a single type of simple revenue transaction, for example rental property that we discussed, remember, when there is a lack of control on revenue recognition, there is a high probability of the fraud risk in revenue recognition, and doing or rebutting the fraud risk at that time is not appropriate. Again, obtaining and understanding or evaluating the fraud risk is a continuous or dynamic process. So once let's say for example initially I rebutted this. Remember I said at the start you rebut, or at the start there's a presumed risk, but at the end there might be chances that you rebut. So it's a process. It's not just a one-step approach. So at the start, if there is a presumed risk, I rebut it, but after doing the analysis or the testing of the control, I identified something is missing. Then what I will do is I'll again create a presumed risk. I'll again, I will go and cancel that rebut of the risk of fraud risk in revenue recognition, and I create a presumed risk of fraud because now I have the evidence. Okay, so this is a continuous process. I may take a decision, but based on the evidence available later on, I may have to take another decision which is appropriate in the circumstances. Then you have this current scenario. So what happened in the current scenario? And this was nothing but the provision or the reference to the standard. Okay. So current provision. And the final part is that what you should have done. The conclusion. Conclusion means that, okay, auditor while performing the risk assessment procedure should have considered the complexity and the nature. Fraud risk in revenue recognition means rebutting was not appropriate. No adequate controls were there, so the audit team rebutted the fraud risk was incorrect. Okay. Moreover, the audit team should have treated the risk of improper revenue recognition as a significant risk, fraud risk. And now we are required to report as per section 143.12 because the amount involved is more than 1 crore as per the prescribed limit. So this is reference to section 143.12. 12. So this is how you are required to answer the question. Any doubt with respect to this one? Any doubt?
Sir, this is the ideal answer, or it is expected to write in exam? The exactly, I mean this lengthy answer details.
See, this is the expected answer that you are required to write in exam. See, it's not like the lengthy or something. It is what is asked based on what you need to write.
Okay.
Sometimes there might be a straightforward answer which might not be that much detailed. So there could be both of the scenarios.
Okay.
There is one more thing you may ask, that okay, is there any shortcut, like for example, if we do not code the provisions or the standard names or numbers or their particular part, we directly go to the current scenario and conclusion if we skip this one? So usually no. I would say this is the appropriate way to write the answer, where you first quote your provision, then you provide the current scenario, and then you give a conclusion. So the reader of the answer, when the person who is checking your paper will get a flow and essence of the question in detail. Okay, this is something, is a provision you are quoting, that is, you remember the provision, you have applied the provision appropriately, you are explaining the current scenario, so you have an understanding of the current scenario also, and then you are giving a conclusion by linking both of them. So that shows that you have the knowledge of the provision, you understand the current scenario, and by concluding and by providing or correlating both of them, you are giving a conclusion.
Okay. Okay.
Raj, I will suggest that the recent questions of MTP questions, you practice it first, because those are made for practice. If you have any doubt in any point in time in those questions, I will be ready to help you guys, perfectly fine. But I will suggest, give a attempt first on those questions, solve it by yourself, and then if you have a doubt, I'm there, don't worry on that. Yes, then no issues. If you have a doubt, we can discuss the doubts anytime. What you can do is you can post your doubts. If it is related to the topic, we can take it immediately. If it is not related to the topic, either at the end or in the subsequent sessions, we can take that particular topic. Is it related to the? Can you just post your doubt so that I can see and go through that? Okay. Let us see one more question. Mr. Manoj, the audit manager, was ready to make inquiries of management and others within the entity as appropriate to determine whether they have the knowledge of any actual suspected or alleged fraud affecting the entity. However, he was not sure who could be included in these inquiries beside the management. Kindly guide Mr. Manoj with examples of others within the entity to whom the auditor made directly or direct inquiries about the existence of or suspicions of fraud. So, Mr. Manoj is there, he want to conduct inquiries but not sure whom to include. So you need to tell me who should be included in the inquiries, or Mr. Manoj should consider which people in the inquiries. Take a minute, read the question and try to answer. Okay, Hemant, very good.
So after management, he can inquire with the internal audit function team. Is there any actual what are the positions are there? Fraud any exists? Then after internal auditors, operating personnels, employees who are head of the department or involved in a complex transactions, ethics officers, person dealing in fraud, means after fraud is detected, he may directly inquire with the persons dealing in that fraud.
Correct, absolutely correct. Yes. Anyone else would like to add more things on to this? Anyone? Very good. Yes, Abhakesh. Great. Anyone else? Would like to add over here? Okay, I'll tell you the answer. See, in this scenario, we have discussed this. Not only management, we can reach out to other people in the organization, including the internal audit function. For example, operating personals. Remember, we can reach out to operating personals. We can reach out to employees. We can reach out to employees involved in complex and unusual transactions with different level of authorities like head of department. Okay. In-house legal counsel, chief ethics officer, person charged with dealing with fraud, like if there is a forensic accounting team or fraud investigators in a corporate, so those persons we can ask them and we can discuss about them, like do they know about any fraud or something like that. Okay, and based on their information we can perform the risk assessment procedures. So while performing the inquiries, I can reach out to these people to understand about the any actual suspected or alleged fraud. I may also reach out to the internal auditors and I may also read the internal audit reports. So sometimes management make you available the internal audit reports, whatever internal audit has happened. In that scenario, you may also go through those internal audit reports, and if you can identify something, then it's good for you. So this is particular answer in the current scenario. Any doubt with this? No? Okay, let us see one more question, if no further doubts. While formulating the audit plan for the statutory audit of Jal Jeevan Limited, the audit manager explained to the team that the auditor is only required to test the appropriateness of the journal entries recorded in the general ledger and the other adjustment made in the preparation of the financial statement when there is a high risk of management override of controls. However, Mr. Sijoy, the engagement partner, has a different opinion. You tell me who is correct. We'll go to the options at the later stage, but tell me, there is one audit manager and there is an audit partner. They both have a different opinion. Who is correct?
Shall I answer?
Yeah.
Uh, the only word that might be suspicious because there are other methods as well, like checking the biasness of the accounting estimates and business, transaction which are out of the business rationale, that also need to be looked rather than only this.
Okay. Okay, great. Anyone else would like to add something more? Yes, Yogesh, absolutely correct. Anyone else? Anyone? Okay, Ginny, very good. Anyone else? No? Okay. See, what we are discussing over here, first of all, here the audit manager, okay, is saying that the auditor is only required to test the appropriateness of the journal entries recorded in the journal ledger when there is a high risk of management override of controls. Is it so? We discussed something different. Remember, we discussed that irrespective of the risk of the auditor, irrespective, I remember I discussed this particular term. I'll highlight in yellow. Irrespective of the auditor's assessment of the risk, manual journal entry will be tested, accounting estimate will be reviewed. Remember, here in this scenario, in this particular question, the manager is saying no, we only need to test when there is a high risk, which is incorrect. They need to test when irrespective of whatever assessment the auditor makes about the management override of control, and hence the engagement partner who is having a different opinion is correct. Clear? So irrespective of the auditor's assessment, we need to test appropriateness of manual journal entries recorded in the journal ledger because of the management override of controls. Any doubt? Any doubt? Okay. There is one question that I need to take it up with respect to the professional ethics I have received. So that is CA Ram, a practicing chartered accountant, is well known for his expertise in handling GST cases at the GST tribunal, and he does not provide any assurance service. Given long-standing reputation in the field, CA Ram is approached by a company to file an appeal in the tribunal against the GST demand. Okay. Which was imposed by CA Ram offers to accept this much fees for filing the appeal at the GST tribunal. Okay, so here the doubt that I have received is that you have answered as per the clause 10 part 1 first schedule. Can you explain me why you answered this as a clause 10?
Because I have seen a similar question on similar line. There was percentage difference, and but here is no such percentage difference. Matlab, he asked demand, matlab, percentage of demand which can be waived off. But in this question, they directly quoted the fee, but they are referring schedules as well. So I thought schedule also need to be mentioned. As we have discussed at that time, ki if there is word schedule, then we should also quote. There may be two answers.
Yeah, I'll tell you the scenario how it is. See, my clause 10 is applicable when there is, I charge percentage based on fees. Remember, we discussed that in detail in clause 10. Now here there is no percentage based on. If you see the question itself, it doesn't talk about percentage based. There is no misconduct per se involved in this. So referring to the clause will not be correct. Are you getting my point?
Okay, I got it. Because I have seen the same question, so I have pasted the same
Yes,
answer.
yes, yes, yes. I totally agree. There might be a same question on the similar line, but the point here is, if there is no misconduct, then why I will write clause 10? For misconduct, there should be some misconduct involved. Then only I will refer to the schedules. Then only I will refer to some clause. Here, first of all, there is a non-assurance service. If you provide a non-assurance, remember, if there is a non-assurance service to non-audit client, there you are allowed to have percentage base. But in this question itself, it is a fixed base, what you say, fees that is being charged. So there is no percentage. Question is drafted in such a way that you may have an impression that it is related to some clause, but it is not, because there is no misconduct involved. The only thing is he is providing some services. Now, when a chartered accountant is providing the services, I need to just check that whether this is part of management consultancy service or not, whether he will be deemed to be in practice or not. So, am I clear? Are you getting the point over here?
Yeah, it just like seen the same question, same answer. So I thought that might be the same, but it is a changes. So I should not refer. Though, but schedule was given in the question that you should write. Okay.
And that's why it becomes very important in the exam also to read the question in detail. So what happens is, at times, by understanding or by having a first quick read of the question, we see, no, this is something similar with that question. Answer should be that. And over there, we get stuck, or we provide wrong answers. Even when we write answer, remember at the 3-step approach that we discussed over here, the provision, current scenario, and the conclusion. This is the reason we say to write the current scenario, because even while writing the current scenario, you will understand what is the question about. This shows your understanding about the question. Or at times, when people write current scenario, something different strikes to them. Okay, no, I have a different understanding, but I'm writing something else. There is some issue in my understanding of the question. Let me go back and read again. So, yeah, in this question, basically it is related to there is no misconduct involved. So, clause 10 will not be part of that.
I'll ask you one more question last.
Okay. Diggy and Associates conducted stock audit of PQR Limited as per the instructions issued by ASG Bank. However, instead of visiting the site where the stock was lying, the firm relied on the Management Information System report, along with the inspection report and the photographs of the stocks taken by the employees of PQR Limited. The photographs were also carrying the date time printed on them. Comment with reference to the CA Act and the schedules thereto. So you wrote answer 7, 8, 9, but the answer was only referring to 7 of second schedule, part 1 second schedule, correct?
Yes.
Okay, see, I'll explain this one also, don't worry. Now, when I'm going to answer a question, I need to understand what is the misconduct related to or about. Okay. So remember, what is 7 about? I am grossly negligent. That is a 7. When I talk about 8 talks about fails to obtain sufficient information, and clause 9 fails to invite attention to any material departure from the generally accepted audit principles. Now, in the question, if you see, there is nothing mentioned about that whether I fail to invite or not. So when I say I am failed to invite, when I do not provide that particular detail in the audit report. When I'm drafting my audit report, either in the OM paragraph or in somewhere else, if I bring attention of the user or the reader to that departure, then it is fine. But here in the question, there is no information about the audit report. So I cannot conclude whether I failed to invite or not. That's why clause 9 is not part, or it should not be quoted here. Now talking about clause 8. If you see, they have photographs of the date and time printed of the stock. Okay? photographs of the stock taken by the employees. There is a management information system report and the inspection reports. Okay. The only thing is here they missed to they did not went to the particular site and they did not perform. So they are grossly negligent or they have not exercised due diligence. That is fine. Why 8 will not come? Because 8 says that if you fail to obtain sufficient information which is necessary for your opinion, or if you take an exception that is, you know, is of such a nature that your opinion goes for a toss. In this scenario, I don't have a value of the inventory. Okay, I don't have a value of the inventory. I'm doing a stock audit as per the bank's instruction. I cannot say that, you know, my opinion may go on toss, or what is the value of inventory, what is the scenario. There could be multiple processes, there could be multiple things that might be there as per the instructions. So hence quoting clause 8 is also you know, not appropriate, because I don't know whether that is a material portion, which is, you know, which I'm taking such an exception that my opinion is going on a toss. Still I have some evidence with me, some information with me, like management information system reports, inspection report, photographs with the date and time printed on them. So I have some details, but there was a gross negligence on my side because I did not visit and perform that procedure on the site. That's why clause 7 will be there.
Okay, I just have to read that ACs are not optical. AC 501 I applied, AC 580 also I applied, that written representation are not sufficient, so obtaining sufficient information is not there. So, and the material departure was also there. So okay, I got it, gross negligence. I need to restrict it to the text only. I don't need to hypothesize.
Yeah.
Or further, even if I write 7 and 8, the 8 and 9, so the examiner only checks 7 and give the marks, or what exactly he will do?
See, then when you write 7, 8 or 9, what you need to do is you need to specifically mention your answer that, okay, why you are referring to 8 and 9. You are assuming that that is material. Say 9, you are assuming that you in audit report nothing is mentioned, because question is silent on that. In question there is nothing written about whether he failed to invite the attention in the audit report and whether it was a material part, so that my opinion is going on a toss. So those information should be there, then only I will be able to quote in the question. Otherwise it is not appropriate to quote, or else you have to take, you know, in your answer you have to assume something, you have to write that in your answer that, okay, we assume this is the scenario, that's why we are also referring to 8 and 9.
No, the logic I given for 9 was that AC 501 was not complied, because in that we have to attend physical inventory. So I
See,
have referred
we
that.
have to, correct. SA 501 says
Yeah.
that you need to perform specific procedure, but clause 9 talks about when you fail to invite. So the misconduct is if I do not perform a procedure and I don't invite attention of the user on that failure. Let's say I did not perform, but I still mentioned in my audit report that I did not perform. So I brought attention of the user, then clause 9 will not be applicable.
Okay, that I got it. And secondly, for 8, I just said that because written representation are not sufficient evidences, and then a substitute of other evidences. So I concluded that the sufficiency of the information that is not necessary. But here we are not expressing opinion, so that also will not. Thank you very much.
No issue, perfectly fine. Any other doubt, guys? Any doubt? Okay. If no doubts, then that was essay 240 that we discussed in detail. Very important topic, very important essay. Okay, that's why I took the time and explained you in detail with the questions. In the next session, we will be covering 2 more essays, that is essay 250, 260. Okay, We will covering both of the essays, and we will also touch upon essay 299. So I will request everyone to read those essays, to read the chapter 2, and that will be really helpful for you guys when we will discussing the topic. Okay guys, if no further questions, then thank you for participating in today's session. I will see you in the next session.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Ashok.
Thank you.